They laughed at us. That was the first thing. The aliens didn't whisper. They didn't mutter under their breaths, they laughed. To them, humans were frail things, all bone and soft tissue, too fragile for the brutal wars that scorched the galaxy. The Yegrath, as they called themselves, were tall, plated with natural armor like obsidian carapace. Their muscles rippled with strength, their jaws could crush stone, and their black eyes burned with a cold disdain for anything smaller than themselves. To them, our arrival at the Alliance War Council was a kind of joke. Send the humans to carry supplies. One of them scoffed. Better yet, use them as medics, they'll break before the enemy even fires a shot. And the others, representatives of half a dozen species, chuckled along. It wasn't as though we hadn't heard it before. Humanity was new to the galactic stage, and new species always endured a trial by fire. But this was worse than mockery, this was dismissal. We were not considered warriors, only fragile creatures stumbling into battles too large for us. The Yegroth proved their point soon enough. In a joint campaign against the Corran raiders, they let humans fight alongside them, but only in the rearguard, where danger was supposed to be lighter. The Yegroth led the charge in their armored ranks, convinced their size and strength would shatter the enemy. But war, as every human soldier knew, never followed the script. The Corran ambushed, plasma fire rained down, rupturing steel, splitting flesh. Yegrath warriors fell, screaming, their carapace cracking under the precision of the Corran's energy weapons. Chaos tore through the battlefield, and the Yegrath found themselves pinned, bleeding, and desperate. The humans in the rearguard heard the cries. Among them was Sergeant Michael Rains. He was not the strongest human alive. He was not even the biggest in his unit. He was, however, the kind of man who had carried his friends out of burning houses back on Earth. The kind who never walked away when someone needed help. When he saw 3 Yegrath soldiers collapse under the crossfire, their massive frames too heavy for any one alien comrade to lift, Michael didn't hesitate. He dropped his rifle, charged into the storm of fire, and did the unthinkable. He hoisted all 3 of them armor weight, and blood included, onto his back and shoulders. His legs nearly buckled, but he gritted his teeth, every muscle screaming as he staggered step by step through the plasma-lit battlefield. The aliens who mocked humanity stared in stunned silence as the man they had called weak dragged 3 of their warriors through fire and death, refusing to let any of them fall. It wasn't strength alone, it was will. A will they had never seen before, and in that moment, the laughter died. The Yegrath weighed nearly 3 times as much as a man. Their armor alone could crush a human if dropped the wrong way. And yet Sergeant Michael Rains did not stop. Every step was agony. His boots sank into the mud as plasma bolts hissed past his head, burning holes into the earth around him. The smell of charred soil and scorched flesh filled his lungs, but his grip did not falter. The 3 wounded warriors hung across his shoulders like mountains. One of them coughed, black blood spilling between jagged teeth. "Leave us," the Yegrath soldier rasped. His voice was a thunderous growl, but the words were weak, barely a whisper compared to his kind's usual roar. Michael didn't answer. He couldn't waste the breath. He just kept moving. Behind him, his squad covered the retreat. Human rifles chattered, precise bursts of red streaking across the smoke-choked battlefield. The Corran pressed harder, confused by the sight of a lone human carrying what should have been impossible cargo. Their hesitation bought precious seconds. When Michael finally stumbled into the triage zone, mid-ex-human and alien alacrushed forward, the injured Yegrath were lifted from his shoulders, their massive frames lowered onto stretchers with cracking urgency. And then silence, not on the battlefield that still raged with screams and fire, but among the soldiers who had seen what happened. Yegrath warriors stood frozen, their black eyes wide, their mandibles trembling with disbelief. To them, this was not just an act of bravery, it was an act that defied nature itself. One Yegrath officer, her carapace splintered and bleeding, pointed a clawed finger at Michael. "How?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "Your bones should have snapped. Your lungs should have given out. No creature of flesh can carry." Michael sat down hard on the ground, his chest heaving. Sweat poured from his face, his hands shaking violently. He wiped mud from his eyes and gave a faint grin. "You think too much about limits," he said between breaths. "Humans don't stop just because it hurts." The officer said nothing. She had no reply. News traveled fast. Within hours, the story spread across Kumte. The weak human who carried 3 Yegrath giants became a whispered name, then a shouted one, then a legend. Even soldiers who hadn't been there repeated the story as though they had seen it themselves. The Corran raid was repelled, but that was almost a footnote. The true shockwave came afterward, when the Yegrath High Command was forced to acknowledge what had happened. For the first time in living memory, They summoned a human into their war council not as an observer, not as a medic, but as a warrior whose actions demanded respect. Michael stood before towering alien generals, his uniform still torn and burned, while their voices echoed through the chamber. Perhaps, one admitted slowly, we were wrong about humans. But Michael only bowed his head and said, we don't fight to prove strength. We fight so others can live. And that answer unsettled them more than his strength ever could. Respect didn't come easily from the Egrath. Their culture was built on trial, on fire, on proving worth through deeds again and again. One moment of strength, they told themselves, could be luck. A single feat, no matter how impossible, might be dismissed as chance. So they tested him, not with words because words were useless in the Egrath way, but with action. The High Command arranged what they called the Trial of Endurance. It was a brutal tradition in which warriors crossed the Iron Plains, a stretch of land seared by endless lightning storms and choked with black dust. The air itself seemed heavy, grinding against lungs until weaker creatures collapsed. The Egrath believed only those with armor-plated bodies could survive it. When Michael was told he would join the trial, he didn't flinch. He simply laced his boots tighter and asked how far he had to go. The journey began at dawn. Egrath warriors, towering and armored, marched beside the lone human. Each one looked down at him with a mixture of scorn and curiosity. The ground trembled with every step of their clawed feet. Michael's steps were smaller, lighter, but his pace never faltered. Hours turned into half a day. The dust burned their throats. The air cracked with stray bolts of energy that seared the horizon. One Egrath stumbled, his carapace smoking from a lightning strike, but he pushed forward, refusing to fall behind. Michael's skin blistered where the heat touched him. His lips split, his shoulders ached, and yet he said nothing. He remembered the words of his drill sergeant back on Earth. Pain is just the body's way of asking if the mind is still in charge. When night fell, several Egrath collapsed, their bodies trembling with exhaustion. Medics pulled them away, declaring them unfit to continue. Out of 24 who started, only 10 remained. And the human, Michael's uniform was torn, his body slick with sweat and dust, but he kept moving. Step after step, one foot in front of the other, while the armored giants beside him looked on in disbelief. His endurance was not the endless power of muscle and bone, it was the refusal to yield. By the second dawn, only 5 Egrath were left standing, and the human, when they finally crossed the Iron Plains and reached the obsidian cliffs that marked the trial's end, the commanders were waiting. The surviving Egrath dropped to their knees, panting. Michael stood tall, though every part of his body screamed to collapse. The High Command could no longer deny what they saw. A creature of flesh had endured where half their armored kin had failed. One commander turned to the others, his mandibles twitching with an expression close to awe. Strength, he said, is not always muscle. Sometimes it is fire hidden in the marrow. Michael just drank water from his battered canteen, too tired to answer. But in the silence, the Egrath warriors bowed their heads to him, not out of pity, not out of ceremony, but out of respect. Respect was one thing, trust was another. The Egrath might have bowed their heads at the Iron Plains, but they were still warriors of pride. To them, humans remained an enigma, a small, fragile race with strange endurance and stranger will. War soon forced the question. The Charon raiders, humiliated by their failed ambush, struck again, this time with numbers enough to break the Alliance front. Their plasma cannons tore craters into the battlefield, their aerial craft shrieked overhead, and their infantry poured into the trenches where humans and Egrath now fought side by side. Michael found himself in the mud once more. The trenches were narrow, half flooded with rainwater, echoing with screams and the hiss of incoming fire. Egrath warriors fought ferociously, their strength undeniable, but they were not used to trench warfare. Their sheer size made them easy targets, their armor clumsy in the tight spaces. It was the humans who adapted. Michael barked orders through the chaos, his voice raw from shouting. Cover the gaps. Don't waste fire-short bursts. Aim low. His squad obeyed without hesitation, their rifles snapping in disciplined rhythm. Every shot counted. Egrath's soldier, massive and bleeding, collapsed beside him. The alien tried to rise, but the mud and weight of his shattered armor pinned him down. Michael didn't hesitate. He ripped off his own jacket, shoved it into the wound to stop the bleeding, then grabbed the soldier's weapon, a weapon far too large for human hands. The recoil nearly snapped his arms, but Michael gritted his teeth and fired. Plasma bursts ripped into the advancing current, cutting them down one by one. The Egrath soldier stared in disbelief, not because the human saved his life, but because he had wielded a weapon designed for giants. All along the trench, humans moved like fire through dry grass. Small, quick, relentless. Where a Yeagrath fell, a human dragged him back. Where a gap opened, a human filled it. They did not match the aliens in size or strength, but their ingenuity, their stubborn refusal to let ground be taken, turned the tide. By nightfall, the trench still stood. Smoke curled above the battlefield, bodies littered the ground, and the Corone retreat sounded like thunder rolling away into the dark. When silence finally came, the Ugrath commander walked through the mud. His carapace was cracked, his arm broken, but his voice was strong. He looked at Michael, his armor burned, his body bruised, his hands still trembling from the giant weapon, and gave the words no human had yet heard from a Yggdrath brother. The word was heavy, ancient in their tongue, a title given only to equals in blood and battle. Michael said nothing at first. He was too exhausted, too hollowed out by the day's fight. But then he smiled faintly, wiped the mud from his face, and replied, "Glad you're starting to see it." That night, in the trenches lit by burning wreckage, the Yggdrath finally stopped calling humans weak. They began calling them something else, brothers. And the war dragged on, battles blurred together, smoke, fire, blood, and the ever-present thunder of plasma cannons. Yet, in those battles, something shifted. Wherever humans and Yggdrath fought together, whispers followed. It wasn't about weapons or strategy. It was about the way humans refused to let go. The Yggdrath had always measured strength in victories, in broken enemies, in scars carved across their carapace. But they noticed something strange in their human allies. Even in defeat, humans carried themselves like victors. When the trenches collapsed, humans rebuilt them overnight. When food ran low, they rationed with grim humor. When all hope seemed gone, they found a joke, a song, or a story to remind everyone that survival was still possible. It was a strength the Yggdrath had never understood. Michael Rains embodied it. One night, during a brutal siege, the Corone launched wave after wave against their fortress. The walls shook, ammunition dwindled, and medics worked until their hands bled. At the height of the assault, a young human private froze in terror, unable to reload his weapon. Michael knelt beside him, calm in the chaos, and pressed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Breathe," he said simply. "You're still here. That means you fight." The boy nodded, his trembling slowing. He loaded his rifle and returned to the line. A Yggdrath warrior had watched the exchange. Later, he asked Michael, "Why comfort the weak? Fear is weakness." Michael shook his head. "Fear means you care about living. Courage is moving forward anyway." That answer unsettled the Yggdrath deeply. For centuries, they had believed only in crushing fear through dominance, through strength. Yet this fragile human claimed that fear itself could be a source of courage. The lesson spread. Slowly but surely, Yggdrath began to notice how humans fought not for glory, but for each other. They noticed how humans carried their wounded even under fire, how they would rather risk their own lives than abandon a comrade. It was not that humans lacked fear. It was that they carried it and each other through the fire. The turning point came weeks later, when the Corone unleashed their deadliest weapon, a siege beast, towering and armored, its maw spitting molten fire. The Yggdrath charged, their strength meeting strength, but the beast crushed them underfoot. Plasma blasts bounced harmlessly from its hide. The line began to break. Then Michael acted. He scrambled up the beastie's side with nothing but grenades strapped to his chest and grit in his teeth. Every step, he should have fallen. Every swipe of the beast's claws should have torn him apart. But he climbed higher and higher, until he reached its armored spine. He pulled the pins, jammed the grenades into a crack in its plating, and jumped. The explosion lit the battlefield. The beast roared, stumbled, and collapsed in fire. And from the smoke, Michael crawled, broken and bleeding but alive. The Yggdrath stared in silence. This was not the strength of muscle, it was the strength of will. And they knew, at last, why the humans had come to war. The battlefield smoldered for days after the siege beast fell. Black smoke drifted into the alien sky, and silence finally replaced the thunder of war. Michael lay in a medbay, his body wrapped in bandages, ribs fractured, one arm bound in a cast. By all accounts, he should have been dead. Yet his eyes were clear, and when the Yggdrath commander entered the chamber, Michael was sitting upright, trying to swing his legs over the side of the bed. "You should be still," the commander rumbled. His mandibles clicked with something that might have been amusement. "Most warriors take weeks to rise after such wounds." Michael smirked faintly. "Humans don't like staying down." The commander was silent for a long moment. Then he lowered his massive frame and knelt on one knee, a gesture no Yggdrath had ever offered to a human before. "Once," he said slowly, "we called your kind fragile. We thought you would break in our wars, but I have seen you carry 3 of my brothers through fire. I have seen you endure the iron plains. I have seen you teach courage to the fearful. And I have seen you strike down a beast no Egrath could kill. Michael listened, quiet, the commander's black eyes fixed on him. You are not weak. You are something else. Something we do not yet have a word for. But in our tongue there is a name reserved for the rarest kind of warrior. Not the strongest, not the fastest, the one who carries others when they can no longer walk. We call them stone-bearers. The title hung in the air, heavy with meaning. To the Egrath it was the highest honor, given only once in a generation. And now, it belonged to a human. Michael shook his head, humbled. I don't fight for titles. I fight so that when the war ends, more of us get to go home. The commander tilted his head, mandibles clicking softly. Perhaps that is why you deserve it most. Word spread quickly. Across the Alliance, the story of the Stonebearer traveled from outpost to outpost, from ship to ship. Other species who had once dismissed humanity now looked at them with new eyes. They were not the strongest, not the most advanced, not the most fearsome, but they carried something the galaxy had, forgotten an unbreakable will to stand, to endure, to lift others even when crushed under impossible weight. When Michael finally returned to Earth, his people welcomed him not as a hero of a single battle, but as a symbol of what humanity could be in the galaxy. Not conquerors, not victims, but carriers of hope. The Egrath never laughed at humans again. In fact, in their war songs, a new verse was added about the day a fragile creature of flesh became a stone-bearer and taught giants what true strength really meant. And so the galaxy learned a lesson it would never forget. Sometimes the smallest shoulders can carry the heaviest burdens.